The solicitor read the will on a Tuesday morning in October, in a room full of people who were all pretending not to hold their breath. He read it in the correct order: the preamble, the declarations, the charitable bequests, the properties listed one by one with the careful precision of a man who understood that clarity now prevented conflict later. He read the land in Devonshire, and the townhouse in Mayfair, and the considerable investment portfolio that the third Duke of Ashenmore had accumulated over 60 years of treating money with the seriousness that other men reserved for religion. He read it all in the measured, unhurried voice of a professional who has delivered good news and bad news in equal measure, and has learned not to telegraph which is coming. And then he reached the final clause. He paused, just briefly, the pause of a decent man steeling himself. Miss Vivienne Ashford, he read, niece of the deceased and sole surviving member of his direct family, shall inherit the entirety of the Ashenmore estate, its properties, investments, and liquid assets, without condition or encumbrance, provided that, at the time of inheritance, she is respectably and legally married. The room stopped breathing. The solicitor continued, because the document required it, and because stopping now would not improve matters. Should Miss Ashford fail to meet this condition, the estate shall pass in its entirety to the next eligible male relation. He set the document down. The mantel clock ticked. Once, twice. In the silence, it was extraordinarily loud. Vivienne Ashford sat very still in the chair nearest the window, with her hands folded in her lap, and her face arranged in the careful, neutral expression she had spent 29 years perfecting. She was not going to give this room the satisfaction of watching her react. She was not going to give anyone here anything they had not already taken. She was, however, doing rapid and increasingly alarming mathematics. Her 30th birthday was 8 days away. She had no suitor. She had no prospects. She had refused, systematically and on principle, every introduction her aunt had attempted over the past decade, because she had always believed, had always known, with the certainty of a woman who has watched enough marriages to understand their architecture, that she would inherit her uncle's estate outright, and that an independent woman with an independent fortune had no earthly need to negotiate her existence through a husband. She had believed this because her uncle had told her, explicitly on 3 separate occasions, that she was his heir. He had apparently neglected to mention the terms. She had, as of this morning, a fortune she could not touch and 8 days to save it. In the back row, her cousin Gerald smiled. It was a small smile. Controlled. The smile of a man who has been waiting for a very specific moment and has finally, after considerable patience, arrived at it. Vivienne did not look at him directly, but she saw it, and the mathematics became, suddenly, considerably simpler. This was not a condition her uncle had added carelessly. Someone had made sure she didn't know about it until it was almost too late. The room emptied with the particular speed of people who have witnessed something uncomfortable and wish to be elsewhere before anyone asks them to have feelings about it. There were condolences, brief, careful, slightly awkward, in the manner of condolences offered to someone whose situation has just become complicated enough that simple sympathy feels inadequate. There were glances. There was the specific quality of silence that descends when a room full of people is collectively deciding what story they will tell about this later. Gerald lingered. Of course he did. He was 41 years old, her uncle's nephew by a different branch, and he had the particular handsomeness of a man who had relied on it for so long that it had become structural, something he wore rather than possessed. He crossed the room toward her with the measured sympathy of a man who has rehearsed this moment. "Vivienne," he said. "My dear, what a shock." "Yes," she said. Isn't it? Something flickered in his eyes. Not concern. The brief, involuntary assessment of a chess player checking the board. If there is anything I can do. There isn't, she said pleasantly. Thank you, Gerald. He left. She watched him go. She watched the door close behind him. Then she turned to the solicitor, who had been waiting with the patient resignation of a man who has learned that the most important conversations happen after the room clears. Mr. Holt, she said. Sit down. He sat. When was this clause added? Holt folded his hands on the desk. He was 60 precise and had served her uncle for 30 years. There was something in his face, not guilt exactly, but its careful management. The will was last amended 14 months ago, he said. And the previous version did not contain the clause. I see, she kept her voice level. Did my uncle explain his reasoning? He did not. A pause. He was not in the final year, a man who explained himself readily. No, she agreed. He wasn't. She looked at the window. The October garden outside was doing its annual dyeing with considerable style. The oaks going gold, the last roses persisting against all reasonable expectation. Her uncle had loved this garden. She had sat with him in it every summer for 20 years, and he had never once suggested that he intended to make her inheritance conditional on acquiring a husband. She pressed the thought down. There would be time for that later. There would be time, after all of this, to sit somewhere quiet and be furious and grieve and feel whatever was waiting underneath the composure. Right now she had 8 days. Mr. Holt, she said, is there any legal mechanism by which the clause could be? No, he said. Not unkindly. I am sorry. The document is sound in every particular. I reviewed it myself. Of course you did, she absorbed this. And the condition itself, respectably and legally married. What constitutes respectable in legal terms? A marriage conducted by a licensed clergyman, properly witnessed and registered. The circumstances of the speed of the arrangement would not, in themselves, render it disrespectable. Provided the parties themselves are of, he chose his words carefully. Adequate standing. She nodded slowly. So a special license. It could be obtained in 2 days with the appropriate connections. And a willing party, she said it flatly. Which is the rather more significant obstacle? Holt was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands. He looked at the desk. He looked at the middle distance with the expression of a man who has something to say and is deciding how to say it. Miss Ashford, he said at last, there is a name I could offer. A suggestion. I want to be clear that it is only that, a suggestion, and one you are entirely free to dismiss. She looked at him. Go on. Edmund Cavendish, he said. The Duke of Blackwell. The name landed in the room and sat there. Vivienne knew the name. Everyone knew the name, not for pleasant reasons. 3 years ago, Edmund Cavendish had been the subject of a scandal that had moved through society with the speed and comprehensive damage of a well-aimed stone through a greenhouse. The details had been various and contradictory, as scandal details always were, but the essential shape of it was this: a woman, a broken engagement, and Edmund Cavendish at the center of both, emerging with his reputation in a condition that polite society had subsequently treated as terminal. She had never met him. Why him, she asked. Holt looked at his desk again. Because he also requires something. And because he stopped. Started again. Because I believe he is a man of his word. Which is, in the present circumstances, perhaps the most important quality. She studied him. You've spoken to him. It was not a question. Holt's expression confirmed it. When, she said. Yesterday, he said quietly. The word landed. Yesterday. Before the will was read. Before she had any idea what the will contained. Mr. Holt, she said very carefully. How did the Duke of Blackwell know about the clause in my uncle's will before I did? Holt met her eyes. In his was the specific look of a man who has kept a secret for 14 months and has just, with some relief, reached the end of it. That, he said, is something I think he should explain himself. Delia was waiting in the carriage. She was Vivienne's oldest friend, 31, sharp-minded, married to a cheerful baronet who adored her and stayed largely out of her way, which she considered an ideal domestic arrangement. She had insisted on accompanying Vivienne to the reading, and had been persuaded, with some difficulty, to wait outside on the grounds that Vivienne needed to be able to control her own face, and could not do that if Delia was in the room making expressions. She took one look at Vivienne climbing into the carriage and said, "How bad?" "I have 8 days to get married or lose everything," Vivienne said. Delia stared at her. "I'm sorry," she said. "I thought you said." 8 days, Vivienne said. To find a husband, obtain a special license, and conduct a legal marriage ceremony, or the entire estate passes to Gerald. A silence. "Gerald," Delia said, with the particular inflection of a woman who has met Gerald and formed a comprehensive opinion. "Gerald." "Absolutely not," Delia said, with the decisive finality of someone resolving a matter of principle. "Right. Who is there?" "There must be someone." "What about?" She began running through names with the focused efficiency of a woman conducting a military assessment. She dismissed 4 candidates in 30 seconds on grounds of character, availability, and one unfortunate incident at a card party 3 years ago that she considered disqualifying. "Edmund Cavendish," Vivienne said. Delia stopped. "The Duke of Blackwell," Vivienne said. "I heard you," Delia said. "I was just—" She looked at Vivienne with an expression that contained, in equal parts, alarm and the involuntary interest of a woman who reads a great deal and recognizes a compelling narrative when it presents itself. He knew about the clause already. Didn't he? Apparently. And you're going to go and ask him. I'm going to go and find out what he knows, Vivienne said. And then I'm going to decide. Delia looked at her for a moment. You're not frightened, she observed. I'm furious, Vivienne said. It feels similar from the outside. Delia nodded slowly. Then she leaned forward and rapped on the carriage roof. Blackwell House, she called to the driver. She settled back and looked at Vivienne with the expression of a woman who intends to hear everything and will not be persuaded to wait outside this time. Tell me everything Holt said, she said. Leave nothing out. Blackwell House was in Grosvenor Square, a large, well-maintained townhouse that managed to suggest both wealth and a complete indifference to whether anyone was impressed by it. The windows were clean. The steps were swept. The brass knocker was polished. Everything about it was correct and nothing about it was performative, which was, Vivienne thought, either admirable or unsettling, and she had not yet decided which. She went alone. Delia remained in the carriage with the martyred expression of a woman, accepting an injustice for the sake of friendship. The butler answered promptly. He was elderly, impassive, and showed no reaction whatsoever to a woman arriving unannounced at his employer's door, which suggested either exceptional training or that unannounced women were not, in this household, an unusual occurrence. She chose to believe the former. Miss Vivienne Ashford, she said. To see the Duke of Blackwell. "Yes, Miss Ashford," the butler said. "His Grace is expecting you." He stepped back to admit her. She followed him through a hallway that was lined with books rather than portraits. An immediate and startling departure from every ducal residence she had ever visited, all of which seemed to operate on the assumption that ancestral faces were the correct form of interior decoration. These were simply books. Shelves of them, floor to ceiling, clearly read, clearly organized by someone who had opinions about order. She was shown into a study. It was a room that matched the hallway books, a large desk with the controlled disorder of active work, a fire that had been burning long enough to suggest the room was genuinely used rather than staged for visitors. 2 chairs angled toward the fire. A decanter on the side table, untouched. And standing by the window, with his back to her and his hands clasped behind him, looking out at the gray October square, a man. He turned when she entered. He was taller than she had expected, and quieter looking. That was the word that came to her, which was an odd word for a person, but it was accurate. He had the particular stillness of someone who has learned not to use movement as a form of communication. Dark-haired, composed, with a face that would have been called handsome in better circumstances, and was now simply interesting. The kind of face that has been through something and has not entirely recovered, and has decided not to pretend otherwise. He looked at her with dark eyes that were, she noticed, doing precisely what she was doing, assessing, cataloging, forming conclusions. "Miss Ashford," he said. His voice was level. "Low." "Your Grace," she said. "Sit down," he said. "Please." She sat. He sat across from her, in the other chair, in the configuration of 2 people who are about to discuss something important and are each waiting to see who will be direct first. She decided it would be her. "You were expecting me," she said. "Yes." "You knew about the clause in my uncle's will." "Yes." "Before I did." "Yes." He held her gaze steadily. He did not appear uncomfortable. He appeared, if anything, like a man who has been waiting for a specific conversation and is relieved that it is finally happening. "I owe you an explanation." "You owe me considerably more than that," she said. "But an explanation is an adequate beginning." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The acknowledgement of one. "Your uncle," he said, "came to see me 14 months ago." She went very still. "He came alone," Edmund continued. "Without his solicitor, without any advance notice. He sat in that chair," a brief gesture toward the chair she occupied, "and he told me about a clause he intended to add to his will, and he told me why, and he asked me a question." "What question?" she said. Edmund looked at her steadily. "He asked me," he said, "if I was the kind of man who could be trusted to do right by his niece." The fire crackled. Outside, a carriage passed in the square. "And what did you tell him?" Vivienne asked. "I told him I didn't know," Edmund said. "I told him I had not in recent years been in a position to find out." A pause. He seemed to consider that an acceptable answer. Vivienne looked at this man, this stranger who had sat with her uncle 14 months ago, who had known what was in the will before she did, who had apparently been waiting, with some patience, for a woman he had never met to arrive at his door with 8 days left and no other options. She thought about her uncle, about the garden in summer, about the way he had looked at her, sometimes, with an expression she had never been able to fully interpret, something between pride and apology, and the specific sadness of a person who knows something they cannot say. She thought about Gerald's smile. She thought about 8 days. "Your Grace," she said, "I think you had better tell me everything." He looked at her. The quiet, steady look of a man arriving at a decision he had, she suspected, already made some time ago. Yes, he said. I think so too. Outside in the carriage, Delia waited. She waited with considerable patience for someone who was not naturally patient, which was itself an indication of how seriously she was taking the situation. She waited for 40 minutes. When Vivienne finally emerged and climbed back into the carriage, her expression was different from the one she had gone in with. Not lighter exactly, but different, the look of a woman who has received information that has rearranged something fundamental and has not yet finished deciding what to do with it. Well, Delia said. He knew my uncle, Vivienne said. For 14 months, he has been waiting for me to need help. And I don't know yet whether that is the most alarming thing I have ever heard, Vivienne said slowly, or the kindest. Delia looked at her for a long moment. Those two things, she said, are not mutually exclusive. Vivienne looked out the window at Blackwell House, at the clean steps, the polished knocker, the windows that gave nothing away. No, she said quietly. They are not. 7 days left. Vivienne did not sleep well. This was not in itself unusual. She had never been a reliable sleeper. Her mind had always been the kind that treated the hours between midnight and dawn as an opportunity for unsolicited review of everything that had ever gone wrong, might go wrong, or was currently in the process of going wrong. She had developed over the years a series of strategies for managing this. Reading, correspondence, the methodical organization of problems into categories, which was less a solution than a way of making chaos feel administrative. Tonight the categories were not cooperating. She lay in the dark of her uncle's Mayfair townhouse. Her townhouse, technically, for another 7 days, conditional on a set of circumstances that would have seemed farcical if they had not been so immediately and comprehensively threatening, and looked at the ceiling and thought about Edmund Cavendish. He had talked for an hour. Not continuously. It was not the speech of a man who had rehearsed, which she found, on reflection, more credible than if it had been. It was the careful, considered account of someone choosing what to reveal and in what order, with the precision of a man who understands that information, poorly sequenced, can mislead even without lying. He had known her uncle. Not well and not for long. They had met through a mutual acquaintance 3 years ago, before the scandal, when Edmund had still been the kind of man who attended things and was invited to them. Her uncle had liked him, had kept in contact after the scandal, quietly, in the way of a man who forms his own opinions and does not adjust them based on what rooms are saying. 14 months ago, her uncle had come to see him. He told me about the clause, Edmund had said, in the chair across from her with the fire between them. He told me he intended to add it, and he told me why, and he asked whether I would be willing, if the situation arose, to assist. Assist, she had repeated. His word. He was precise about it, a pause. He said he would not ask me to do anything I considered dishonorable. He said the arrangement, if it came to it, would be temporary, with terms agreed in advance, and that his niece would be, he had stopped. Chosen his next words with visible care. He said his niece was not a woman who would need managing. He said she would understand the situation clearly and make her own decision without requiring it to be dressed up as something it wasn't. She had been quiet for a moment. It was, she had thought, exactly the kind of thing her uncle would say. Precise, practical, and underneath the practicality, something that was very nearly a compliment. And you agreed, she had said. I agreed to be available, Edmund said. If the situation arose. If you chose to come. And if I hadn't come. He had looked at the fire. Then you had found another solution, and that was better for everyone. She had looked at him, This quiet, still man with a scandal attached to his name like a label no one had bothered to remove, and she had said, "What do you get from this?" He had looked back at her. "My reputation is not what it was." A marriage, a respectable one, publicly conducted, to a woman of established standing, would go some distance toward restoring it. And the scandal itself, a silence, would not be undone, but might become less defining. "Tell me about it," she had said. The scandal. And he had. Or rather, he had told her the shape of it. The outline. The essential facts without the center, which she had noticed and filed away. Because a man who tells you almost everything is telling you something about the part he is leaving out. She lay in the dark and thought about all of this. 7 days. She had 7 days and one option, and an uncle who had apparently orchestrated the entire situation from beyond the grave, with the quiet strategic satisfaction of a man who had always been considerably cleverer than he let on. "I know, Uncle," she said to the ceiling, in the tone she generally reserved for conversations with people who were not present to respond. "I know you thought you were helping." The ceiling offered nothing. She got up, lit the lamp, and began to write. She arrived at Blackwell House at 10 o'clock the following morning. This time she brought Delia, because Delia had pointed out, with the reasonableness that characterized her at her most immovable, that a woman negotiating a marriage contract without a witness was a woman negotiating alone, and that Vivienne had spent enough of her life alone without adding this particular occasion to the list. Vivienne had conceded the point. The butler admitted them both without visible surprise. Edmund was in the study, the same room, the same fire, the same 2 chairs, though this time there was a 3rd chair added with the quiet practicality of a household that had been notified of an additional guest and had acted accordingly. Edmund rose when they entered. He looked in the morning light much as he had looked the previous afternoon, contained, composed, with that quality of stillness that she was beginning to understand was not coldness, but something more like discipline. A man who has decided, at some point, that the gap between what he feels and what he shows must be carefully maintained, and has been maintaining it for long enough that it has become automatic. He looked at Delia with an expression of neutral courtesy. Delia looked at him with the comprehensive assessment of a woman who makes up her mind quickly and does not generally revise. "Lady Fenwick," he said. "Your Grace," Delia said, with perfect politeness and the specific quality of attention that meant she was cataloging everything. They sat. Mrs. Weston, the housekeeper, gray-haired and efficient, brought coffee, and then withdrew, and the door closed, and the 3 of them sat in the fire-lit study with the business of the morning between them. "I've thought about it," Vivienne said without preamble. "I assumed you had," Edmund said. "I have questions before I agree to anything." "Of course. And terms. If we proceed, I will need specific terms in writing, agreed before anything else happens." Something in Edmund's expression shifted, not surprise, but perhaps the confirmation of a prediction. "So will I," he said. She looked at him. "You have conditions." "I have one," he said. "You may find it either reasonable or offensive, depending on your perspective. I would rather say it now than discover later that it was a problem." "Say it." He looked at her steadily. "I will not be party to a deception that harms anyone who doesn't deserve to be harmed. If we do this, we do it honestly, not publicly, not in ways that require announcing our private arrangements to society, but between ourselves, between our solicitors, with anyone who has a legitimate need to know. No pretense of sentiment that doesn't exist. No performance designed to mislead." She looked at him for a long moment. "That," she said, "is exactly what I was going to say." Something moved across his face. The almost smile again, which she was beginning to recognize as his version of a more considerable reaction. "Then we agree on the first principle," he said. "What are your terms?" She had written them out the previous night, in the clear, organized hand of a woman who has learned that clarity now prevents misery later. She took the folded paper from her reticule and placed it on the desk between them. He picked it up and read it without comment. Beside her, Delia sat with the expression of a woman watching something she finds both entirely sensible and faintly extraordinary. The terms were these: the marriage would be conducted legally and without pretense. They would maintain separate households for the duration, though public appearances together would be required for the first 3 months. He would have no access to her inheritance, not to spend, not to manage, not to direct in any way. She would have no claim on his estate. After 1 year, if both parties were in agreement, they would pursue a quiet separation, not a divorce, which was both difficult and public, but a formal separation of the kind that left both parties legally distinct and socially intact. If before the year was out either party wished to revisit the terms, they could do so in writing, with mutual consent. He read it twice. "The separate households," he said. "That is your preference or a practical necessity?" "Both," she said. "I have lived independently for 10 years. I don't intend to stop." "I wasn't suggesting you should," he said. "I was asking because if the arrangement is to appear credible to society for the necessary period, some visible degree of," he paused. "Domestic proximity may be required." "Dinner twice a week," she said. "Alternating houses. Public engagements as needed. Nothing that requires us to pretend to be something we are not in private." "That's acceptable," he said. "The inheritance clause," she said. "Non-negotiable." "I wasn't going to negotiate it," he said. "It is your inheritance. I have my own estate. I don't require yours." She studied him. He said it simply, without emphasis, in the tone of someone stating a fact rather than making a virtue of themselves. She found, somewhat to her surprise, that she believed him. "Your condition," she said. "Honesty between us. No performance." "Yes." "That cuts both ways," she said. "I know." "Then I want to revisit something you told me yesterday," she said. "The scandal. You told me the shape of it. You left out the center." A silence. The fire crackled. "I did," he said. "If we are proceeding on terms of honesty," she said, "I would like the center." He looked at her. Then he looked at Delia. "Lady Fenwick." "Stays," Vivienne said. "She is my witness. Everything said in this room is said to both of us." Edmund was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands. He looked at the fire. He had the expression of a man who has kept something for a long time and has had sufficient time to decide whether releasing it constitutes relief or loss, and has not entirely reached a conclusion. "3 years ago," he said, "I was engaged to be married." He said it to the fire, not to them. His voice was level. Her name was Miss Arabella Foss. The engagement was not romantic on either side. Mutually convenient. She needed a title. I needed a pause. I was not thinking clearly about what I needed. The engagement suited my family, and I had not yet learned to weight my own judgment above theirs in such matters. "What happened?" Vivienne asked. "Gerald Ashford happened," Edmund said. The room went very still. Vivienne felt something cold move through her. She kept her face neutral through long practice. "Gerald," she said carefully, "is my cousin." "I know," Edmund said. He looked at her then. "I know. I want you to understand that I am not telling you this to affect your opinion of your family. I am telling you because you asked for honesty, and this is the honest account." "Go on," she said. Edmund looked back at the fire. "Gerald knew Arabella," he said. "I discovered, 2 months into the engagement, that he knew her considerably better than I had been aware. He had been attentive to her before the engagement in ways that she had not entirely discouraged. When the engagement was announced, he was unhappy. He wanted her himself, Delia said. It was the first thing she had said since they sat down. Whether he wanted her or simply could not tolerate losing, Edmund said, I cannot say with certainty. What I can say is what he did. He told Arabella something about me. I don't know precisely what, she would never repeat it. But it was sufficient to convince her that the engagement should be ended, and ended publicly, and in a manner that ensured the fault was seen to be mine. What did society believe? Vivienne asked. That I had behaved dishonorably toward her, Edmund said. The specific allegations were various, and none of them were ever stated directly, because allegations stated directly can be refuted. Insinuations cannot. His voice was perfectly level. The levelness of long practice. Arabella ended the engagement at a public gathering. She was distressed. I did not defend myself in the moment because he stopped. Because, Vivienne said. Because she was genuinely distressed, he said. Whatever Gerald had told her, she believed it. And I was not willing, in that moment, to make her situation worse by creating a scene. And afterward, Vivienne said. Why didn't you defend yourself afterward? A pause. The longest one yet. Because, he said, by the time I understood the full shape of what Gerald had done, he had made it clear that if I spoke, if I named him, if I attempted to correct the account, there would be consequences for someone who had nothing to do with any of it. Who? Vivienne said. He looked at her. That, he said quietly, is the part I am not yet ready to tell you. She looked at him. He looked back at her. It was a direct, steady exchange. Not evasion, not deflection, but a clear and honest statement of a limit, offered as such. Not yet, she repeated. Not yet, he said. I will tell you. When I am certain, when I am sure of several things that I am not yet sure of. I am asking you to trust that the reason is a good one. It was, she thought, either a reasonable request or the kind of request that preceded a very unpleasant revelation. She was becoming aware that with Edmund Cavendish, these two categories might not be mutually exclusive. All right, she said. Not yet. He looked at her with something that might, in better lighting, have been gratitude. In the meantime, she said, we have practical matters. She straightened in her chair. A special license will take 2 days to obtain. That leaves 5 days before my birthday. We will need a clergyman, 2 witnesses, she glanced at Delia, who nodded once firmly, and a sufficient public appearance beforehand to make the marriage legible to society. I can manage the license, Edmund said. And the clergyman. I know a man, trustworthy, discreet, not inclined to find the circumstances remarkable. The public appearance, Vivienne said. Lady Harcastle's dinner is on Thursday. It is the most attended event of the week, and everyone who matters will be there. I am not, Edmund said, with a brevity that communicated considerable history, generally invited to events that everyone who matters attends. You will be to this one, Vivienne said. Lady Harcastle is my godmother. I will speak to her. He looked at her. You would ask your godmother to invite a man, with my reputation, to her dinner party. I would ask my godmother, Vivienne said, to invite my future husband to her dinner party. The framing changes things considerably. The almost smile arrived again. This time it stayed slightly longer. It does, he agreed. Then we are in agreement, she said. She looked at the terms on the desk between them. I'll have Mr. Holt draw up the formal document this afternoon. You should have your own solicitor review it. I will. She stood. He stood. Delia stood with the contained energy of a woman who has a great deal to say and is marshalling it for the carriage. Vivienne extended her hand across the desk. Edmund looked at it for a moment. Then he took it briefly, formally, the handshake of two people concluding a business arrangement with the particular seriousness of matters that are also, underneath, something else entirely. Miss Ashford, he said. Your Grace, she said. She turned to go. She was at the door when he said, Miss Ashford. She turned. He was still standing by the desk, with his hands at his sides and the firelight behind him, and that expression she was beginning to catalogue, the one that said more than the words that accompanied it. Your uncle, he said. When he came to see me 14 months ago, at the end of the conversation, when everything had been said, he told me one more thing. She waited. He said, Edmund continued, that if his niece came to this house, it would mean that every other option had been exhausted. And that if that happened, it would not be because she was desperate. A pause. It would be because she had decided on her own terms that this was the best available course. And that a woman who makes decisions on her own terms is, he stopped. He said you were worth being honest with. He said most people weren't, in his experience, but you were. The room was very quiet. Vivienne stood at the door and looked at the man across the room who had known her uncle and kept a secret for 14 months and told her almost everything with the precise, careful honesty of someone who understands that almost is not the same as all, but is considerably more than nothing. She thought about her uncle, about the garden, about the expression she had never been able to interpret. She understood it now. He was right, she said. About most people. She left. In the carriage, Delia said nothing for a full 2 minutes, which was, in Vivienne's experience, unprecedented. Then she said, Gerald. Yes, Vivienne said. Gerald did this to him. 3 years ago. And now Gerald is standing in that room smiling, because he thinks he's going to get the estate. Yes, Vivienne said. And Edmund Cavendish has been sitting in that house for 3 years, Delia said slowly, not defending himself because Gerald threatened someone. And your uncle knew all of this, and he arranged. She stopped. They looked at each other. My uncle, Vivienne said carefully, was a man who played a very long game. The clause, Delia said. He didn't add it to force you to marry. He added it to force Gerald into the open. The carriage moved through the London streets. October light fell through the windows in the particular way it did in autumn, slanted, golden, slightly melancholy. If that's true, Vivienne said, then there is something Gerald knows or has done that my uncle expected him to reveal if he was sufficiently threatened. And the marriage threatens him. The marriage removes his claim to the estate, Vivienne said. If he wants to stop it, he has to act. And if he acts, he shows his hand, Delia finished. They sat with this for a moment. 6 days, Delia said. 6 days, Vivienne agreed. She looked out the window. Gerald is going to do something, she said. Before Thursday. Before the dinner. He will not simply wait. No, Delia agreed. He won't. Then we need to be ready, Vivienne said. And I need to warn Edmund. And she added, more quietly, I need to find out who Edmund has been protecting for 3 years. Because whatever Gerald threatened him with then, he will use again now. And this time, I intend to be prepared for it. That evening, a note arrived at Blackwell House. It was brief, written in a clear and unhurried hand. Gerald will move before Thursday. I don't know how. I thought you should know that I intend to be ready, and that ready in my case includes knowing everything. When you are certain, I am waiting. VA. Edmund read it twice. Then he sat at his desk for a long time with the note in his hand and the fire burning low, and the particular expression of a man who has been alone with a secret for 3 years, and has just been offered, for the first time, the possibility of not being. He picked up his pen. He wrote 4 words. He sent it. The note that arrived at Vivienne's house an hour later read, I know. Tell me when. 6 days left. Gerald came on Wednesday. Vivienne had expected him. Not on Wednesday specifically. She had not known the day, but she had known the visit was coming with the particular certainty of someone who has grown up watching a person and has learned over decades to read the grammar of their behavior. Gerald moved toward opportunity the way water moved toward low ground, inevitably, and by the path of least resistance, and with the absolute confidence of something that has never been successfully stopped. He arrived at 11 o'clock, unannounced, with the ease of a man who has always walked into this house as though it were already his. Vivienne received him in the drawing room. She had chosen the drawing room deliberately, formal enough to signal that this was not a familial visit, furnished well enough to remind him of what was at stake. She was sitting when he was shown in, and she did not stand, which was a small thing and entirely intentional. Vivienne, he said, with the warmth of a man who has decided warmth is the correct instrument for the present moment. He kissed her cheek. He smelled of expensive cologne, and the particular self-satisfaction of a man who believes the morning is going well. Gerald, she said. Sit down. He sat in the chair across from her. I've been worried about you, he said. Since the reading. It was a terrible shock. For all of us. Was it, she said. Something moved in his eyes. A brief recalibration. Of course. None of us expected. Gerald, she said pleasantly. You knew about the clause. A silence. He stopped. Started again on a different note. I had heard certain things. Through the solicitor's office. You know how these things. You knew, she said. Before the reading. That is why you smiled. He looked at her. The warmth had not left his face, but something underneath it had shifted. A subtle reordering. The way a room looks different when the furniture has been moved an inch, and you cannot immediately identify what has changed. I want to help you, he said. His voice had dropped to the register of sincerity. That is why I am here. I know what you are considering. Cavendish. He said the name the way one sets down something one wishes to appear not to be handling carefully. I have heard various things, Vivienne said. Then you know his reputation. I know what society says about his reputation, she said. Which is not, in my experience, the same thing. Gerald leaned forward. His expression had acquired the specific quality of a man, about to offer something he has been holding in reserve. I know what happened, he said. 3 years ago. The Foss girl. I was there, Vivienne. I saw it. She kept her face neutral. Tell me. He told her. It was, she had to acknowledge, a well-constructed account. It had the texture of a true story, specific details, appropriate hesitations, the occasional reluctant admission that made the whole more credible. Edmund Cavendish had behaved dishonorably toward Arabella Foss. He had made promises he had not kept. He had, when confronted, responded in a manner that had caused Arabella genuine distress. Gerald had been present. Gerald had tried to help. Gerald had, in fact, been the one to support Arabella through the aftermath, and he had never spoken of it because he was not the kind of man who made capital from others' suffering. He said all of this with the fluency of something rehearsed enough to no longer sound rehearsed. Vivienne listened. She listened the way she had listened to her uncle's lawyers for 20 years, with the full surface of her attention, and underneath it, the quieter work of noting what was not said. The gaps, the places where a story folds over itself. "Gerald," she said when he had finished, "where were you in October of 1849? He blinked. "I what?" "October 1849, she said. "Specifically the second week." "Where were you?" He looked at her with the particular blankness of a man whose mental ledger has just been unexpectedly audited. "I don't see what." "Humor me," she said. "I was in the country," he said. "At Ashenmore. Your uncle had invited a party for the shooting." "Yes," she said. "He had. I was there. I remember it very well." She looked at him steadily. "I remember that you were there for the first 3 days and then left early. Do you remember why?" A pause. "I had business in London." "What business?" "I don't recall the specifics." "The engagement announcement," Vivienne said, "between Edmund Cavendish and Arabella Foss was published in the second week of October 1849. The morning after you left Ashenmore early for business, you cannot now recall." The drawing room was very quiet. Gerald looked at her. The warmth was still on his face. It was, she now observed, entirely architectural, a structure built so long ago that it had become self-maintaining, continuing to stand even when nothing inside it remained. "I'm trying to protect you," he said. His voice was still measured, still kind. "From a man who will use you, Vivienne, who will see your situation and take advantage of it. I have seen what he does to women who trust him." "Have you?" she said. "Arabella." "Where is Arabella Foss now?" Vivienne asked. A fractional hesitation. "I believe she is in. She moved, I think." "To the north." "Do you know her direction?" "I know. We lost touch. After the—" "You lost touch," Vivienne said, "with the woman you supported through a considerable personal crisis. These things happen." "Yes," she said. "They do." She looked at him. At this man she had known her entire life, at Christmas tables and summer parties, and the particular occasions that families accumulate over decades, all the ordinary proximity that can exist between two people who have never, not once, actually known each other. "I'm going to marry Edmund Cavendish," she said. "I am telling you this as a courtesy, because you are my family. The arrangements are already in progress." Gerald was very still. "Vivienne." "Gerald," her voice was not unkind. It was simply final. "Whatever you came here to do this morning, you should know that it hasn't worked. And whatever you are planning to do next," she held his gaze, "I would encourage you to reconsider." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood, adjusted his coat, and produced a smile that was his finest work, warm, regretful, the smile of a man doing his best in difficult circumstances. "I hope," he said, "that you won't regret this." "Thank you for coming, Gerald," she said. He left. She sat in the drawing room for a few minutes after the door closed, with her hands folded in her lap, and the particular feeling of a woman who has successfully done a thing she found distasteful and knows she will have to do it again, in a harder form, before long. Then she called for her coat. She was going to Blackwell House. Edmund opened the door himself. This surprised her. She had expected the impassive butler. Edmund stood in the doorway in his shirt sleeves, without a coat, holding a book with his finger marking the page, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who has just been interrupted and does not mind. "Miss Ashford," he said. "Gerald came this morning," she said. "May I come in?" He stepped back immediately. She came in. He led her to the study, their study now, she thought, in the sense that it was the room where things were discussed and decided, which gave it a kind of functional ownership. The fire was lit. The chairs were occupied by a quantity of books that he moved without ceremony, stacking them on the desk with the automatic efficiency of a man who has never organized his library by whether someone might sit in it. She sat. He sat. She told him about Gerald's visit, all of it precisely, in the order it had happened. He listened without interrupting. This was, she had already established, characteristic of him. He was not a man who spoke into the spaces in other people's sentences. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "October 1849, he said. "You notice the discrepancy, too." "It is the week he came to see Arabella," Edmund said. "Before the engagement was announced. I didn't know it at the time, I learned it afterward." "What did he say to her?" Edmund looked at the fire. "I don't know precisely. She would not tell me. She was, by the time I understood what had happened, she was frightened, and she wanted to be away from London, and I thought the most useful thing I could do was help her go." "You've been supporting her," Vivienne said. "Financially. Since it happened." A pause. "Yes. And Gerald knows this." "Yes. And he threatened too. To tell her family where she was," Edmund said. "Her family did not. They were not kind people, Miss Ashford. She left London to get away from Gerald, and she was also, in some measure, getting away from them. If they had found her direction, if Gerald had provided it," he stopped. "She would have lost the one thing she had managed to build for herself." The room was very quiet. Vivienne looked at this man, who had spent 3 years absorbing a ruined reputation, rather than redirect danger, toward a woman who had already been frightened enough. She looked at him carefully, in the way she looked at things she needed to fully understand. "Edmund," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. She noticed it. She thought he noticed it too, though he gave no indication. "Yes," he said. "Gerald will use her again," she said. "When he realizes he cannot stop the marriage through me, he will use her. He will contact her family or threaten to, and he will do it quickly because he is running out of time." Edmund's jaw tightened. "I know. Then we need to remove his leverage," she said. "Before Thursday." "How?" he said. "Short of—" "Her family," Vivienne said. "What is the nature of the threat precisely?" "That he would tell them her direction." "And certain circumstances of her departure," Edmund said carefully. "She left without their knowledge. In their telling of it, there are things that could be said that would damage her further." "Are they true?" Vivienne said. "No," he said, without hesitation. "Then they are slander," she said. "And slander can be answered." She paused. "Is she willing to answer it?" "She has spent 3 years building a life that does not require her to," Edmund said. "I cannot ask her." "I'm not asking you to ask her," Vivienne said. "I'm asking you to write to her. To tell her what is happening. To give her the choice." She looked at him steadily. "She deserves to know that someone is trying to use her. And she deserves the opportunity to decide for herself what to do about it." Edmund looked at her. He had the expression of a man who has been managing a situation for so long, alone, that the suggestion of sharing the management has temporarily disordered him. "She may say no," he said. "She may," Vivienne agreed. But she should be asked. A silence. You are, Edmund said slowly, a considerable distance from what I expected. What did you expect? He seemed to consider the question seriously. Someone more frightened, he said. Given the circumstances. I told you, she said. Frightened and furious feel similar from the outside. She paused. On the inside, they are entirely different. Which are you? He said. She looked at the fire. Both, she said honestly. In different proportions at different moments, she looked back at him. Right now, predominantly furious. Gerald has been waiting for this for years. He knew about the clause. He probably influenced the clause, or tried to. He spent 3 years neutralizing you so that, when this moment came, you would not be a credible option. Edmund was very still. He planned this, Edmund said. I think my uncle planned it first, Vivienne said. And I think Gerald tried to plan around it. And I think she stopped. I think my uncle was cleverer than either of us has yet fully understood. What do you mean? She looked at him. The clause forces Gerald to act. Any action Gerald takes will reveal something. My uncle knew that, she paused. My uncle also knew that the person most likely to be a safe harbor in this situation was someone Gerald had already tried to neutralize. Because a man who has survived Gerald once understands what he is. Edmund absorbed this slowly. She watched him work through it, the quiet, methodical intelligence of a man who has been alone with his thoughts for long enough to be thorough with them. Your uncle, he said at last, chose me because Gerald had already shown him his hand. Yes, she said. And because you didn't break. The word landed between them and stayed. Edmund looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the almost smile, not the careful composure, not the steadiness that she was beginning to understand was a kind of architecture he had built and maintained through long necessity. Something underneath all of that. Briefly, unwillingly visible. Write to her, Vivienne said quietly. Today if you can. She should know. Yes, he said. All right. The letter went to Shropshire that afternoon. While Edmund wrote it, Vivienne sat at the other end of the desk and wrote her own correspondence to Lady Hardcastle regarding Thursday's dinner and to Mr. Holt regarding certain aspects of her uncle's financial records that she wished to review, and to Delia, who had sent 3 notes since morning and deserved the courtesy of a response. It was, she thought, an odd thing to sit in a near stranger's study, at his desk, writing letters by his fire, with the companionable scratch of 2 pens and the sound of the house around them. Odd and not somehow uncomfortable. She had expected discomfort. She had prepared for it. It had not arrived. She was not certain what to do with that. When Edmund sealed his letter and set it aside, he looked up and found her watching him. What is it? He said. Nothing, she said. And then, because they had agreed on honesty, I was thinking that this is strange. Yes, he said. And not, she said. He looked at her. No, he agreed. Not entirely. They returned to their letters. Gerald's next move came the following morning, and it was not what she had expected. She had anticipated something directed at her. Another visit, perhaps, or a letter, or the social maneuvering of a man working his way through mutual connections to apply pressure. She had prepared for these. She had considered responses. She had not prepared for the note that arrived at Blackwell House at 8 o'clock on Thursday morning, 4 hours before Lady Hardcastle's dinner. Edmund sent his carriage for her immediately with a single line, "Come now." Bring Holt. She arrived to find Edmund standing at his desk with a document in his hand, and an expression she had not seen on him before. Not anger, something colder than anger and more focused. Delia was with her. Holt arrived 7 minutes later, breathless, with his document case and the expression of a man who has received urgent summons before and knows they are seldom for pleasant reasons. Edmund laid the document on the desk. It was a legal filing. Gerald had engaged counsel and filed, that morning with the relevant court, a challenge to the validity of the marriage clause in the will. His argument was specific and had the fingerprints of careful preparation. The clause, he contended, had been added to the will under undue influence. The late Duke, in the final year of his life, had been in declining health, and his judgment had been susceptible to manipulation. The clause did not reflect his genuine wishes. It reflected the interference of parties who had access to him in his final months. The implication, never stated, hovering above every line, was that Edmund Cavendish had influenced the Duke. "He's saying you manipulated my uncle," Vivienne said. "Into adding a clause that would require you to marry me," Edmund said. "Yes. That is," Delia said, with the comprehensive precision of a woman who has reached a conclusion, "possibly the most audacious thing I have ever heard." Holt was reading the filing with the focused expression of a man doing rapid legal calculations. "It is not entirely without procedural basis," he said. "A challenge on grounds of undue influence requires evidence, but the filing is sufficient to create delay. If the court agrees to hear it, the marriage cannot proceed while it is contested," Edmund said. "Technically," Holt said carefully, "the marriage can proceed, but its validity would be legally uncertain until the challenge is resolved, which means the inheritance condition would also be uncertain. Which means even if we marry," Vivienne said, "Gerald could argue that the inheritance has not been validly triggered." "Until the court rules," Holt confirmed. "How long would that take?" Holt looked at his hands. "Months. Possibly longer." The room was quiet. Vivienne looked at the filing. She looked at Gerald's solicitor's name at the bottom, a firm she recognized, expensive, connected, the kind of firm that Gerald should not have been able to afford. "Where is Gerald getting the money for this?" she said. "He borrowed against the expectation of the inheritance," Holt said quietly. "He was so certain," Delia said. "He had reason to be," Vivienne said. "He had spent 3 years making certain that the most obvious alternative was not viable." She looked at Edmund. "He thought you were neutralized. He thought that when the will was read and I had 8 days and no prospects, I would have no choice but to accept the loss. He did not account for your uncle having already spoken to me," Edmund said. "No," Vivienne said. "He didn't." She looked at the filing again. Something was forming, not yet complete, not yet speakable, but there, in the way that solutions sometimes arrive before they have finished assembling themselves. "Mr. Holt," she said. "My uncle visited Edmund 14 months ago." "Yes," Holt said. "You knew about that visit." A pause. "Yes." "Did you document it?" Holt looked at her. A slow, considering look. "The Duke asked me to be present," he said carefully, "as a witness, and to retain a record of what was discussed." The room went very still. "A record," Vivienne said. "A detailed one," Holt said. "At the Duke's specific instruction." He stopped. He said that if the clause was ever challenged, he wanted it to be very clearly documented that he had added it of his own volition, with full understanding of its implications, and in the presence of his solicitor. Another pause. He said he expected it to be challenged. He said he knew precisely by whom. Edmund sat down slowly. Vivienne looked at Holt. "He knew," she said. "He knew Gerald would do this." "He planned for it," Holt said. The documentation is comprehensive. It includes his reasoning, his state of mind, his specific intention. It includes a statement, signed and witnessed, that no person other than himself influenced the amendment. He paused. It also includes a separate letter, sealed, to be opened only if the clause was legally challenged. "What is in it?" Vivienne said. "I don't know," Holt said. "He did not tell me." He said the person who needed to know was Gerald. The silence that followed had a particular quality, the quality of a room in which several people are simultaneously understanding something that changes the shape of what came before. "He set a trap," Delia said. Very quietly. "Yes," Vivienne said. "Gerald could have left it alone," Vivienne said. "He could have accepted the marriage without challenging it." "If he had," she stopped. "Whatever is in that letter stays sealed." "But he couldn't leave it alone," Edmund said. His voice was very quiet. "Because that is not what Gerald does." "No," Vivienne said. "It isn't." She looked at Holt. "Open the letter," she said. Holt reached into his document case. He had brought it, she realized. He had brought it this morning when Edmund summoned him because he had known. He had been waiting, as Edmund had been waiting, as her uncle had arranged for them all to be waiting. The envelope was cream-colored, sealed with her uncle's crest. Holt broke the seal with the careful deliberateness of a man, completing a long-held instruction. He read it. His expression, over the course of 30 seconds, moved through several things that he subsequently arranged into composure. He set it down on the desk. "You should read it," he said. "Both of you." Vivienne read it first. Then she passed it to Edmund without speaking. It was 2 pages. Her uncle's handwriting, familiar, formal, the handwriting of a man who took correspondence seriously. It began, "If this letter has been opened, then Gerald has done what I believed he would do, and I owe certain people an explanation that I was not, in life, brave enough to give in person." It continued for 2 pages. It detailed, with the precision of a man who had spent a year preparing a document he intended to be unimpeachable, the following: that Gerald had, 8 years prior, defrauded the estate of a sum of money that the Duke had discovered and chosen not to prosecute, on the condition that Gerald made no further claims on the estate during his lifetime. That Gerald had violated this condition by learning of the will's contents through a clerk in Holt's office, who had subsequently been dismissed. That Gerald had, 3 years ago, interfered in the engagement between Edmund Cavendish and Arabella Foss, the details of which the Duke had learned through his own inquiries and documented here. That the clause in the will was intended not to restrict Vivienne but to protect her, and to ensure that Gerald, if he challenged it, would expose himself completely. "I was not able to do this while I lived," the letter concluded, "because Gerald would have found a way to cause further damage to people who did not deserve it. I am doing it now because I am beyond his reach, and because my niece is not, and she should have the truth. She has always deserved the truth. I am sorry it took me this long to be brave enough to give it to her." Edmund finished reading. He set the letter down. He looked at Vivienne. She was looking at the letter with an expression he had not seen on her before, not the composure, not the fury underneath the composure. Something older and quieter than either. "He knew," she said. "All of it. For years." "Yes," Edmund said. "He could have told me." "Yes," he said. "He could have." "He was protecting you," Edmund said. "Imperfectly. And too quietly. In the way of people who love someone and are frightened of what protection costs." He stopped. "I am familiar with the pattern." She looked at him. He looked back at her. It was a different kind of looking than they had done before, less assessment, less cataloging. something that did not require a name yet, but was there, clearly and without ambiguity, in the space between them. "Gerald," she said at last. "Yes," he said. "Gerald." She straightened. "Mr. Holt, what does this letter do to his filing?" Holt, who had been sitting with the careful stillness of a man, allowing a private moment its necessary duration, looked up. "It answers it comprehensively," he said. "The fraud documentation alone is sufficient to establish that Gerald has a material financial interest in challenging the will that disqualifies him from doing so in good faith. The filing will not survive it. How quickly can you respond?" "I can have a response filed by end of day," Holt said, "with the documentation attached." "Do it," Vivienne said. "And the letter, it becomes part of the record." "It does," Holt said. "Gerald will see it." "Good," Vivienne said. "I want him to see it." Holt collected his papers, stood, and withdrew, with the quiet efficiency of a man who understands when his work is the most useful thing he can offer. The door closed. Delia stood and looked at Vivienne and Edmund in turn. She had the expression of a woman who has watched something she expected to take considerably longer arrive at its conclusion ahead of schedule. "I'll wait in the carriage," she said. "Delia." "I'll wait in the carriage," she said pleasantly, "for as long as is necessary." She left. Vivienne stood by the window. The square below was doing its ordinary Thursday morning business. Carriages, pedestrians, a woman walking a very small dog with the focused determination of someone who considers this the most important task of the day. London, entirely indifferent to the fact that several people's lives had just been materially rearranged in a study on the second floor. Edmund stood beside her. Not close. The appropriate distance of two people who are not yet certain of the geography between them. "He called you brave," Vivienne said. "My uncle." "In the letter." "He was being generous," Edmund said. "He was being accurate," she said. "You protected someone for 3 years at considerable cost to yourself." "It was not heroic," Edmund said. "It was the only thing I could think of that was better than the alternative." "That," she said, "is what brave usually is." He was quiet. "Edmund," she said. "Yes." "Tonight. Lady Harcastle's dinner." She turned from the window to look at him. "Gerald will know by then that the filing has been answered. He will be there. He was invited before any of this began, and he is not the kind of man who concedes the field." "No," Edmund agreed. "He will try something," she said. "In public, because he has nothing left to lose, and public damage is the last instrument available to him." "I know," Edmund said. "I want you to know," she said carefully, "that whatever he says tonight, whatever he attempts, I will not believe it. I have enough information to evaluate Gerald's accounts accurately, and I intend to do so." Edmund looked at her. The expression again, the one beneath the composure. More visible now than it had been before. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. "It is simply what honesty requires." "Miss Ashford," he said. "Vivienne," she said. "I think we have arrived at Vivienne." Something in his face shifted. Settled. Like a thing that has been held at a careful distance being permitted, finally, to come closer. "Vivienne," he said. "Tonight, whatever happens, I want you to know the same. Whatever is said. I am not going anywhere." She looked at him. "I know," she said. And she did. That was the thing she had not expected. Not the situation, not the letter, not the careful architecture of her uncle's long plan. She had not expected to know, with this particular quiet certainty, that the man standing beside her at the window was exactly what he appeared to be. She had spent 29 years being careful about what she trusted. She was beginning, carefully, to revise the policy. The carriage came for them at 7 o'clock. Edmund handed her in. She was wearing dark blue, the color of someone who has decided to be entirely visible. He sat across from her in the carriage, and the London streets moved past the windows and neither of them spoke, which was not silence in the uncomfortable sense, but silence in the way of two people who have said enough for now, and are simply together, moving toward whatever comes next. 4 days left. Gerald would be at the dinner. Let him come. Lady Harcastle's dinners were, by general consensus, the social event against which all other social events were measured and found wanting. This was partly the food, which was extraordinary, partly the house, which was Mayfair's finest example of a woman with impeccable taste and the resources to fully indulge it. But mostly it was Lady Harcastle herself, 73 years old, sharp as cut glass, with the particular authority of a woman who has outlasted every person who ever underestimated her, and has therefore earned the right to find the whole business faintly amusing. She received Vivienne in the entrance hall before the other guests arrived, with the focused attention of a woman who has been told something significant and wishes to form her own opinion before the evening begins. She looked at Edmund for a long moment. Edmund bore the inspection with the stillness of a man who has learned that the correct response to being assessed by formidable women is to simply remain still and let them finish. Edmund Cavendish, Lady Harcastle said. Lady Harcastle, he said. I knew your father, she said. He was a good man. Yes, Edmund said. He was. You have his eyes, she said. And his tendency to look like he's thinking 3 things he isn't saying. She turned to Vivienne. I approve, she said simply. Come in. The other guests arrived at 8. There were 30 of them, the particular 30 that Lady Harcastle curated for her dinners with the care of a woman who understands that a room is a composition, and that the wrong element can ruin the whole. Vivienne knew most of them. They knew her. And they knew, because London society processed information with the speed and efficiency of a system that has had centuries to optimize, that something was happening. The looks began immediately. Not rude, these were people too practiced for rudeness, but the specific quality of attention that descends on a room when it senses that the evening is going to be more interesting than anticipated. Edmund moved through the room beside her with the composure of a man who has decided, somewhere between the carriage and the door, that he is done being diminished by other people's narratives. He was not performing ease. He simply was. Steady and present and entirely himself, which was, Vivienne was discovering, considerably more effective than any performance could have been. She watched people recalibrate. It was, in its way, fascinating. Gerald arrived at 8:30. He came in with the easy confidence of a man who does not yet know that the ground has shifted beneath him, or who knows and has decided that confidence is the correct response regardless. He was impeccably dressed. He smiled at the right people. He crossed the room toward the drinks with the unhurried movement of someone who owns the evening. He saw Vivienne and Edmund together. Something flickered across his face, brief, quickly managed. He changed course. Vivienne, he said warmly, arriving at her side. And Cavendish, the name again set down carefully. I didn't know you were acquainted with Lady Harcastle. Lady Harcastle is my godmother, Vivienne said pleasantly. As she has been for 29 years. I believe you knew that, Gerald. A fractional pause. Of course. Of course. I only meant. He looked at Edmund with the smile of a man offering something that is not a smile. Quite a public reappearance, Cavendish. Society will have opinions. Society generally does, Edmund said. I find I've become comfortable with that. Gerald looked at him. Something moved behind his eyes, the rapid, invisible calculation of a man assessing a changed situation. I heard, Gerald said, still pleasantly, that my solicitors received some correspondence this afternoon. Did they? Vivienne said. Rather comprehensive correspondence, Gerald said. Regarding certain historical matters, his voice had not changed. His face had not changed. Everything about Gerald was surface, all the way down. I wonder where such documentation could have come from. From my uncle's solicitor, Vivienne said, who was acting on my uncle's explicit instruction. She looked at him steadily. He planned ahead, Gerald. He was always better at that than you gave him credit for. Gerald was quiet for a moment. These are serious allegations, he said. The fraud claim. It will be contested. I'm certain it will, Vivienne said. You are welcome to contest it. I understand the documentation is quite thorough. Documentation can be questioned, Gerald said. Witnesses can be discredited. His eyes moved to Edmund. Especially witnesses with a vested interest in the outcome. Gerald, Vivienne said quietly. Whatever you are about to do, I would like you to think carefully about whether you are certain you want to do it. It was not a threat. She did not make threats. It was simply the truth, stated with the patience of a woman who has given fair warning and is prepared for it not to be heeded. Gerald looked at her. He looked at Edmund. He looked around the room at the 30 people who were not quite listening with the practiced skill of English society, at Lady Hardcastle across the room who was watching with the specific attention of a woman who sees everything and forgets nothing. He made his decision. She had known he would. People like Gerald always made this decision, because the alternative, retreat, acceptance, the acknowledgement that they had lost, was constitutionally unavailable to them. He raised his voice. Not dramatically. Just enough. I think, Gerald said, that certain people in this room should be aware that the marriage being contemplated, this rather sudden and convenient arrangement, he gestured between Vivienne and Edmund with the light dismissiveness of a man performing concern, is built on a foundation that will not survive serious examination. The room did not stop, but it slowed. The particular slowing of 30 people simultaneously deciding to listen, while appearing not to. Cavendish's reputation, Gerald continued, is well known. What is perhaps less well known is the specific nature of his conduct toward the late Duke of Ashenmore in the final year of his life. A man in declining health. A man susceptible, as elderly men often are, to the influence of Gerald. It was not Vivienne who spoke. It was Lady Hardcastle. She had crossed the room with the unhurried authority of a woman who owns the floor beneath everyone's feet and is reminding them of it. She stood beside Vivienne now, and she was looking at Gerald with an expression that had, over 73 years, caused considerably more formidable men than Gerald Ashford to reconsider their positions. You are making allegations, she said, in my house about a guest I have personally invited on the basis of a legal filing that was, I understand, answered comprehensively this afternoon. She paused. I am curious about the purpose of this. Lady Hardcastle. I am also curious, she continued in the same pleasant tone, about the nature of the business arrangement you entered into with a clerk in Mr. Holt's office. I understand the details are quite documented. She tilted her head slightly. My late husband was a lawyer, Gerald. I have retained certain connections. Information travels. Gerald had gone very still. This is a dinner party, Lady Hardcastle said. at which I expect my guests to conduct themselves accordingly." She smiled at him, with the comprehensive warmth of a woman delivering a verdict in the register of a pleasantry. "I believe you know where the door is." The room was absolutely silent. Gerald stood in the silence for one moment, too, with the expression of a man who has just discovered that the ground he was standing on was not ground at all. Then he set down his glass. He left. The door closed behind him. Lady Harcastle turned back to the room with the serenity of someone who has tidied a minor inconvenience and is now ready to continue. "Shall we go in to dinner?" she said pleasantly. The room exhaled. Conversations resumed. The evening continued. Dinner was extraordinary, as Lady Harcastle's dinners always were. Vivienne sat beside Edmund, which was Lady Harcastle's doing. The seating arrangements at her table were as deliberate as everything else about her, and she had placed them together with the calm authority of a woman who has decided how the evening will proceed and sees no reason for reality to disagree. They ate. They talked with the people around them, and occasionally in the gaps between those conversations with each other. Small things. The food. A comment about the man across the table who had an unfortunate relationship with his fish course. A question she had about one of the paintings in the dining room, which Edmund answered with a specificity that surprised her, and then did not, because she was becoming accustomed to the way his knowledge appeared in unexpected places. It was, she thought, an extremely strange evening to also be a pleasant one. After dinner in the drawing room, Lady Harcastle found her. "Come," she said simply, and led Vivienne to a small window alcove that offered privacy without absence. "He won't try again tonight," Lady Harcastle said without preamble. "Gerald. He knows the room has turned." "I know," Vivienne said. "Thank you. For what you did." "I did nothing that wasn't warranted," Lady Harcastle said. "Your uncle was my oldest friend. I have been watching Gerald Ashford for 20 years. She paused. "I have also been watching you, which you know." "I know," Vivienne said. "You have spent 10 years, Lady Harcastle said, being extremely capable and extremely alone, on the grounds that independence was preferable to the alternative. I have respected that. I continue to respect it." She glanced across the room, to where Edmund was talking to an elderly general with the patient attention of a man who is genuinely interested in what he is hearing. "I am simply observing that the alternative in this case may not be what you have been refusing." Vivienne followed her godmother's gaze. "It is a practical arrangement," she said. "We have been honest about that." "Yes," Lady Harcastle said. "You have been very honest." "Admirably so." A pause. "I wonder if you have been equally honest about the parts that are not practical." Vivienne said nothing. "He looks at you," Lady Harcastle said simply, "the way your uncle looked at your aunt. Which is to say, when he thinks you aren't watching." She patted Vivienne's hand and returned to her guests. Vivienne stood in the alcove for a moment. Then she looked across the room. Edmund was not looking at her. He was listening to the general, with the focused attention she had come to recognize as genuine. He was not performing. He was simply there, steady, present, entirely himself. And then, as though he felt the quality of her attention change, he looked up. Across the room, through 30 people and 6 conversations, and all the ordinary noise of an evening. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them looked away. The carriage home was quiet. Delia had come to collect her, Delia, who had not been at the dinner, and had therefore spent the evening in a state of contained impatience that had expressed itself in 3 notes delivered to the house over the course of the meal. She took one look at Vivienne's face when she came out and said nothing at all, which was itself a form of communication. Edmund had handed her into the carriage at the door. He had held her hand a moment, not long, not dramatically. Just a moment. And he had said very quietly, 4 days. 4 days, she had said. She sat in the carriage now and looked out at the night streets and thought about Lady Harcastle, and about the way Edmund had looked up across a room full of people, and about the difference between a practical arrangement and the thing that a practical arrangement was becoming, increment by careful increment, in the space between two people who had agreed to be honest. Well, Delia said. Gerald left, Vivienne said. Lady Harcastle removed him. Good, Delia said. And the filing will be answered tomorrow. The documentation is comprehensive. His challenge will not survive it. Good, Delia said. And Vivienne looked at her. And, she said, I think my uncle was considerably cleverer than I gave him credit for. I meant, Delia said patiently, Cavendish. Vivienne was quiet for a moment. He is not what I expected, she said. No, Delia agreed. He isn't, is he? She looked at Vivienne with the expression of a woman who has known her for 20 years and is therefore not fooled by anything. You like him. I respect him, Vivienne said. You like him, Delia said again. Delia. You have been, Delia said, with affectionate precision, alone for 10 years on the grounds that no one was worth the adjustment. And you have known this man for 4 days, and you are sitting in this carriage looking like someone who has just discovered that they were wrong about something important. She tilted her head. Am I incorrect? Vivienne looked out the window. No, she said after a moment. You are not incorrect. Delia settled back in her seat with the expression of a woman who has waited a very long time for this particular sentence and is savoring it appropriately. 4 days, she said. 4 days, Vivienne confirmed. The legal response was filed the following morning. Holt delivered it personally, which was unusual. Solicitors generally trusted their clerks with such errands, but this was not, in Holt's assessment, a usual document. He filed it with the careful ceremony of a man, completing something he has been building toward for 14 months. Gerald's solicitors received it by noon. Gerald himself received a summary by 2 o'clock. By 3 o'clock, Edmund received a note, not from Gerald but from Gerald's solicitors, written in the careful language of a firm that has reviewed a situation and concluded that the situation has changed. The filing, it stated, was being withdrawn. The challenge would not be pursued. Edmund read it twice. Then he sat back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he wrote 2 notes. One to Holt, one to Vivienne. Vivienne's note arrived at 4 o'clock. It was brief. Edmund was always brief, she had established, preferring precision to volume. It's over. The challenge is withdrawn. 3 days. And then, beneath the practical information, in the same measured handwriting, a single additional line that was not practical at all. I find that I am looking forward to them. She read it twice. She looked out the window of her uncle's study, her study, for 3 more days and then, in a different sense forever, at the October garden where the oaks were gold and the roses were persisting, and the afternoon light was doing the particular thing it did in autumn that made everything look like the last of something. She thought about 10 years of independence, carefully maintained. She thought about the architecture of a life built to require nothing from anyone. She thought about the intelligence of that architecture and its limitations and the specific quality of the gap it had left. The gap she had been, for 10 years, extremely competent at not looking at directly. She picked up her pen. She wrote back, "So do I." She sealed it and sent it before she could revise it, which was, she thought, probably the correct decision. The special license arrived on Friday. Edmund brought it himself, which he did not need to do. He could have sent it with his man. He came in the mid-morning with the document and the expression of someone who has completed a practical task and is using the completion of it as a socially acceptable reason to be somewhere. Vivienne received him in the drawing room. She took the license and read it with the care she gave to all documents. It was correct. Complete. Her name, her full name, Vivienne Margaret Ashford beside his. Edmund Robert Cavendish, Duke of Blackwell. She set it on the desk between them. The ceremony, she said. Sunday. Sunday, he agreed. At 10 o'clock. The clergyman is confirmed. Delia and Thomas will witness. Yes. And afterward. Afterward, he said, the terms of the arrangement proceed as agreed. Yes, she said. A pause. Edmund, she said. Yes. She looked at the license on the desk. At their names beside each other, in the legal formality of a document that did not know or care about the circumstances that had produced it, only that they were here and had agreed. The terms, she said. The ones we wrote down. Yes. I want to revisit one of them. He was very still. Which one? The one about a year, she said. And the separation. The silence was the most complete silence the room had yet produced. What about it? He said. His voice was level. She had learned to read the levelness now, what it was maintaining. I think, she said carefully, that it was written by two people who were being honest about their circumstances, but who did not yet have sufficient information to be honest about everything else. And now, he said. She looked up at him. Now I have more information, she said. He looked at her. The expression beneath the composure, fully visible now, not held back, not managed. The expression of a man who has been careful for a very long time and is considering, with some seriousness, the possibility of being less so. What information? He said quietly. That you are honest, she said. That you are patient. That you protected someone for 3 years at considerable cost because you could not think of a better thing to do, and then you sat in a house alone and waited, without complaint, for a situation to resolve itself that you had no power to resolve. She paused. And that you look at me, she stopped. How do I look at you? He said. Very quietly. She held his gaze. As though I am someone worth looking at, she said. Not the inheritance. Not the arrangement. Me. The fire crackled. Outside, the garden waited with its patient, autumnal endurance. You are, he said. You are considerably more than worth looking at. He paused. I have been, since the first morning you came to my house and asked me for honesty, I have been aware that the terms of the arrangement were going to become insufficient. I did not say so because I had agreed to them, and I was not going to revise them unilaterally. But you would have, she said. Eventually. I would have asked, he said. With your permission. When I was certain you wouldn't consider it a pressure. She looked at him. I'm asking, she said. Now. With my own permission, which I am giving myself. A pause. Can we remove the separation clause? Edmund was quiet for a long moment. We can, he said, remove whatever clauses you would like to remove. Just that one, she said. For now. Something moved across his face. Something that was not the almost smile. Something more than that, more complete. The full version of whatever the almost smile had always been a fraction of. For now, he agreed. Sunday came with the particular quality of an October morning that has decided to be unexpectedly beautiful, clear, cold, with the low golden light that made Mayfair look like a painting of itself. The ceremony was at 10 o'clock, as planned. Small as agreed. The church was the one Edmund had arranged. Old, quiet, tucked into a street that most of London had forgotten it contained. The clergyman was a compact, cheerful man who had clearly been told the circumstances, and had clearly decided that the circumstances were none of his business, and the ceremony was entirely his. Delia arrived first and stood at Vivienne's side with the expression of a woman who has waited 20 years for something, and is managing her feelings about it with limited success. Thomas, Edmund's man, gray-haired and entirely reliable, stood beside Edmund with the equanimity of someone who has decided this was inevitable since approximately Tuesday. The clergyman began. Vivienne stood beside Edmund in the small, quiet church and listened to the words, the old words, the ones that have been said in English churches for centuries, and thought about all the ways this morning was not what she had planned her life to be, and about the specific way in which it was, somehow, more than she had planned for. She thought about her uncle, and the long game he had played, and the letter that had said, "I am sorry it took me this long to be brave enough." She thought about bravery, about how it generally looked, from the inside, less like courage and more like simply deciding that the thing on the other side of the fear was worth the fear. Edmund was looking at her. Not across a room this time. Beside her. Close enough that she could see, clearly and without ambiguity, the expression that Lady Harcastle had described, the one he had when he thought she wasn't watching. She was watching. He did not look away. The clergyman reached the relevant passage. Vivienne said what was required. Edmund said what was required. The clergyman, with the cheerful efficiency of a man who enjoys his work, pronounced them married. Delia made a sound that she subsequently described as entirely composed, and which was not. Thomas looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man, consulting it on a point of personal satisfaction. Edmund looked at Vivienne. "Well," he said quietly. "Well," she said. "That's done." "That's done," she agreed. Outside the church, in the October morning, with Delia and Thomas a discreet distance behind them, and the city going about its ordinary Sunday business entirely indifferent to the extraordinary morning, they stood on the steps. Edmund offered her his arm. She took it. It was a small thing. Entirely ordinary. The kind of thing that happens between two people every day in every city in England. It felt to Vivienne like the first morning of a country she had not known existed until 4 days ago, and had already, with some surprise and considerable relief, decided she preferred to everything that came before. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Edmund said, "we have breakfast. And then we have whatever comes after breakfast. And after that." He looked at her. The full expression. Nothing held back. "After that," he said, "we find out." She looked at him. This man who had waited 3 years in a quiet house for something he could not name and had not expected, who had kept his word and someone else's secret and his own counsel through all of it, who looked at her like she was worth looking at. "Yes," she said. "We do." 2 days later, on a Tuesday morning in October, Vivienne Margaret Ashford, now Cavendish, Duchess of Blackwell, heir to the Ashenmore estate in her own right and entirely regardless of anyone's opinion on the matter, turned 30. She spent the morning with Edmund in the garden of the townhouse, because the October light was doing its golden thing again, and it seemed wasteful to be inside. She spent the afternoon with Delia, who brought a bottle of something excellent, and the comprehensive satisfaction of a woman who has been proven right about something she cared about. She spent the evening with Edmund again, in the study that was becoming, quietly, without announcement, theirs in the genuine sense rather than the functional one. There were books on both sides of the desk now. Her correspondence mingled with his. The fire burned with the ease of a fire in a room that is genuinely lived in. He had found, somewhere, a small bunch of late roses, the last of the season, the ones that persist against all reasonable expectation. He set them on the desk without comment. She looked at them. "You remembered," she said. "You mentioned them once," he said. "In passing." "I mentioned them once," she said, "in passing." "I was paying attention," he said simply. She looked at him. She looked at the roses. She looked at the room around them, at the books and the fire, and the desk with both their names on the correspondence, and the window where the October dark had settled in. "Edmund," she said. "Yes." "I believe," she said carefully, "that I am going to enjoy this considerably." He looked at her with the full expression, the one that had always been more than an almost smile. "So am I," he said. "So am I." Winter came to London the way it always did. Gradually, then completely, first a sharpness in the air that made the morning walks brisk and the evening fires necessary, then the first frost on the Grosvenor Square garden. Then one morning the city simply woke up gray and stayed that way, as though it had made a decision overnight and saw no reason to revisit it. Blackwell House was warmer than it had been. This was not, Edmund thought, entirely a matter of the fires, though the fires were more consistently lit than they had been in recent years, because Vivienne had opinions about cold rooms that she expressed with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything else. It was something else. Something that existed in the difference between a house that is maintained and a house that is inhabited. He had not, until recently, understood that these were different things. He understood now. The legal matters resolved themselves over the course of November, with the methodical thoroughness of processes that have been properly prepared for. Gerald's challenge was formally dismissed on the 14th. The documentation was, as Holt had promised, unimpeachable, the fraud evidence, the witnessed record of the Duke's intentions, the letter that had been waiting in its cream envelope for the moment it was needed. Gerald's solicitors withdrew with the dignified efficiency of a firm that has assessed a situation and concluded that further engagement would be professionally inadvisable. Gerald himself left London in the 3rd week of November. He went, it was understood, to the Continent, the traditional destination of English gentlemen whose domestic circumstances have become complicated. Whether he would return was, in the opinion of everyone who had followed the matter, unlikely. Vivienne received the news of his departure over breakfast on a Thursday morning and said, "Good." Then she returned to her correspondence. Edmund looked at her over his coffee. "That's all," he said. "What else is there?" she said without looking up. "He is gone. The matter is resolved. Anything beyond good would be giving him more of my time than he deserves." Edmund considered this. "You are," he said, "a genuinely remarkable person." She looked up then. The expression she wore when something surprised her, brief, unguarded, gone almost immediately. "You say that," she said, "as though it has just occurred to you." "It occurs to me," he said, "regularly. I am simply not always certain whether to say it." She looked at him for a moment. "Say it," she said. "When it occurs to you." "All right," he said. She returned to her correspondence. He returned to his coffee. Outside, the November garden waited in its bare, patient way, doing nothing in particular and doing it with complete commitment. Arabella's letter arrived in December. It came addressed to Edmund, which was correct. She did not yet know Vivienne, and correspondence requires a point of entry. But Edmund brought it to the study and set it on the desk between them and said, "This concerns you as much as it concerns me." Vivienne read it. It was written in a careful, slightly formal hand. The hand of someone who has learned to be precise because precision, for a long time, was a form of protection. Arabella was in Shropshire. She had built over 3 years something that she described without drama and with evident satisfaction. A small household, a circle of friends, work that she found useful. She had read Edmund's letter, the one explaining what had happened, the challenge, the resolution. She had read it several times. She was glad, she wrote, that it was over. She was glad, she wrote, that Edmund had not been alone in it. And she wrote one more thing, at the end, in a slightly different register, more tentative, less formal, the voice of someone deciding to say something they are not certain they have the right to say. I have spent 3 years feeling responsible for what happened to you. I know that is not rational. I know that what Gerald did was not my fault, and not yours, and that guilt which belongs to neither of us is simply guilt misdirected. But feelings are not always rational, and I wanted to say to someone that I am sorry. That it cost you what it did. That you bore it the way you did. I hope you are well. From what your letter suggests, I think perhaps you are. Vivienne set the letter down. She was quiet for a moment. She is well, she said. Yes, Edmund said. She wants to know that you are. Yes, he said. Vivienne picked up her pen. Write to her, she said. Tell her you are. And tell her, she paused. Tell her that if she ever comes to London, she is welcome here. Edmund looked at her. She may not come, Vivienne said. She may prefer to stay where she is, and that is entirely right if so. But she should know the door exists. Yes, Edmund said. She should. He wrote the letter that afternoon. Vivienne did not read it, it was his to write. But she was in the study when he wrote it, at her end of the desk, and the companionable scratch of 2 pens filled the quiet room, and when he sealed it, he set it with the outgoing correspondence without comment, and that was that. Lady Hardcastle came for Christmas. This was apparently a tradition of long standing. She had spent Christmas with Vivienne's family for 20 years, and she arrived at Blackwell House in December with 2 trunks, a quantity of opinions, and the settled air of a woman who has assessed a situation and found it satisfactory. She inspected the house on the first morning with the thoroughness of a woman who considers inspection a form of affection. She approved of the books. She approved of the fires. She approved of the way the desk in the study had been arranged, 2 clear territories, overlapping at the center, with an expression that suggested she found it both entirely sensible and quietly eloquent. She played chess with Edmund on the second evening, for 3 hours, with the focused mutual seriousness of 2 people who have each found a worthy opponent and intend to make the most of it. Vivienne watched from the sofa, with a book she was not entirely reading. You let her win the second game, she said, when Lady Hardcastle had gone to bed. I did not, Edmund said. You sacrificed your rook unnecessarily in the 14th move, Vivienne said. You never sacrifice your rook unnecessarily. He looked at her. You were watching. I was reading, she said. I can do both. He was quiet for a moment. She is 73, he said. And she removed Gerald from a dinner party on our behalf, with approximately 6 sentences. She deserves to win occasionally. Vivienne looked at him. At this man who had let a 73-year-old woman win a chess game and would not admit it, and had done it out of a form of respect that he would also not admit. Edmund, she said. Yes. I believe, she said, that you are a genuinely remarkable person. He looked at her. Something moved across his face, surprised, as she had been in November. And then slowly, not the almost smile but the full one, which she had been collecting over the past 2 months like evidence. You say that, he said, as though it has just occurred to you. It occurs to me, she said, regularly. He held her gaze. Then say it, he said quietly. When it occurs to you. I intend to, she said. January brought the formal publication. It was Holt's doing proper, legal, comprehensive. The announcement that appeared in the relevant gazette and the relevant papers was dry and procedural in the way of official notices, which was appropriate. It stated that Vivienne Margaret Cavendish, née Ashford, had been confirmed as the sole heir of the late 3rd Duke of Ashenmore's unentailed estate, the inheritance having met all conditions as set out in the will, the said conditions having been fully and legally satisfied on the 23rd of October last. It stated this in the language of documents that do not care about the story behind them, only the facts. The facts were sufficient. Delia sent a note that consisted entirely of 3 exclamation marks and Vivienne's name, which was, for Delia, a model of restraint. Holt sent a letter of the appropriate professional warmth, which contained, at the very end, a single sentence that was not professional at all. Your uncle would have been pleased. Vivienne read it at the desk in the study. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked out the window at the January garden, bare and cold and entirely untroubled by the season, and she thought about her uncle. She had been thinking about him differently since the letter. She had been angry. She had been sad. She had been grateful and resentful in the complicated, overlapping way of grief that involves someone who loved you and failed you simultaneously. And she had been working through these things in the patient, methodical way. She worked through most things carefully, without rushing, giving each feeling its due, and then setting it in its appropriate place. She had not finished. She suspected she would not finish for some time. But she had arrived, somewhere in December, at something that was not forgiveness exactly. Forgiveness implied a debt that she was not certain she was owed, but was its neighbor. An understanding. A recognition that a person can be insufficient and loving at once, and that the love does not erase the insufficiency, and the insufficiency does not erase the love, and both of these things can be true and the person can still be, in the net of it, someone worth remembering with warmth. She thought he had tried. She thought he had tried badly and too quietly, and at considerable cost to her. She thought he had also, in the end, done the one thing that mattered. He had made sure she was not alone. "All right, uncle," she said, to the January garden, in the tone she used for conversations with people who were not present. All right. In February, they went to the Ashenmore estate. Not to live. They had not decided that yet, and they were both, by temperament, people who preferred to decide things when they were ready and not before. But to see it. To walk the land that was now hers in the full, legal, unambiguous sense. To stand in the house where her uncle had lived and make of it whatever it would become. They arrived on a February morning when the countryside was doing its minimal, stripped-back winter self. The fields bare, the trees skeletal, the sky the particular gray of a day that has not decided what it intends to do. The house stood at the end of a long drive, large and slightly formal, the house of a man who had cared about appearances and had also, underneath the appearances, cared about his niece. Vivienne stood in the entrance hall. She had been here before many times, as a child and as an adult, for visits and holidays and the various occasions of a family's life. She knew this house. She knew its sounds and its smells, and the specific way the light came through the east windows in the morning. But she had never stood in it like this. Edmund stood beside her. He did not say anything. He had learned, or had always known, she was not sure which, that there were moments that did not require comment, only company. She walked through the rooms. The drawing room where her uncle had received guests. The library where he had kept his books and his pipe, and, she now knew, the portrait of her mother that she had never been shown. The dining room. The morning room. The study. She stood in the study for a long time. The desk was her uncle's desk. His chair. His shelves. The window looked out over the south garden, where the painting of the young woman reading had been made, on a summer afternoon, by a man who had wanted to remember his daughter as she was when she didn't know she was being seen. She sat down in the chair. It fit in the way that things fit when they were always meant to. Edmund appeared in the doorway. He looked at her in the chair, at the desk, in the room that was now hers, and his expression was the one she had been collecting, the full one, nothing held back. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. "What do you think?" She looked around the room. At the shelves, the window, the winter garden beyond it. At the desk beneath her hands, worn smooth by decades of use. At the chair that had been her uncle's and was now hers and would, she supposed, eventually be something else entirely. "I think," she said, "that we should open the east wing." Edmund looked at her. "It will need considerable work." "Most things worth having do," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then spring, perhaps. When the weather allows." "Spring," she agreed. He crossed the room and sat in the chair across from her, the visitor's chair, the chair that had held her uncle's solicitors and tenants and guests, and 14 months ago, Edmund himself, in a conversation she had not known was happening and which had changed, in its quiet way, everything. They sat on opposite sides of the desk. "We could divide our time," Edmund said. "London and here. If you wished." "We could," she said. "The estate will need management." "Yes," she said. "It will," she looked at him. "I'm quite good at management." "I know," he said. "I have been observing it for 4 months." And, he said, "I would rather work beside you than beside anyone else I have ever met." She looked at him across the desk. At this man who had come into her life through the peculiar architecture of her uncle's long plan, and had turned out to be, against every reasonable expectation and all her careful prior conclusions about the matter, someone she wanted to keep. "Edmund," she said. "Yes. I want to tell you something." "All right." She folded her hands on the desk. She looked at them for a moment. Then she looked at him, directly, clearly, in the manner of a woman who has decided that honesty, having served her this well so far, is worth continuing. "I came to your house in October," she said, "because I had 8 days and no options and an uncle who had arranged things in ways I did not yet understand. I agreed to our arrangement because it was practical and because you were honest and because I could not think of a better solution." "I know," he said. "I want you to know," she said, "that if I came to your house today, not in October, not with 8 days, not with Gerald and the will and all of it, if I came today simply as myself, simply because I had the choice." She stopped. "Yes," he said quietly. "I would still come," she said. "That is what I wanted to tell you." The study was very quiet. The winter garden waited outside the window. The house stood around them with the patience of old houses that have seen many things and are not easily surprised. Edmund looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the desk. He set his hand over hers, not briefly, not formally. Steadily. The way he did everything that mattered. "I know," he said. "I think I knew in November. I was waiting for you to know it too." She looked at his hand over hers. At the desk between them, worn smooth by decades of other people's lives. At the man across from her who had waited for 3 years, for 14 months, for 4 days, and then for 4 more months, with the patient, absolute certainty of someone who knows that the right things are worth waiting for. You might have said, she said. You needed to arrive at it yourself, he said. You wouldn't have trusted it otherwise. She considered this. You are, she said, occasionally extremely irritating. Yes, he agreed. I've been told. By whom? Myself mostly, he said. I have had considerable time alone to form opinions. She looked at him. The laugh arrived before she could manage it, real, unguarded, the laugh of a woman who has not laughed like this in a long time and had not, until this moment, noticed the absence. Edmund smiled. The full smile which she had been collecting, and which she now understood she would have the rest of her time to continue collecting, which was, she thought, an extremely satisfactory arrangement. They stayed at Ashenmore for a week. On the last morning, before the carriage came, Vivienne went to the south garden. It was February, and the garden was its bare winter self, but she could see, in the shape of the beds, in the structure of the old rose bushes waiting under their winter skeletons, what it would be in summer. What it had been, on the afternoon when a man had commissioned a painting of his daughter reading in a chair, because he wanted to remember her as she was when she didn't know she was being seen. She stood where the chair had been. Edmund came and stood beside her. What are you thinking? He said. That I should like a portrait, she said. Here, in summer, of you, of both of us, she said. If you don't object. He was quiet for a moment. I don't object, he said. Good, she said. It should be informal. Not commissioned. Something a friend might do, if we had a friend who painted. Delia's husband paints, Edmund said. Landscapes mostly. But I understand he is competent. Vivienne turned to look at him. How do you know that? Lady Harcastle told me, he said. In December. While we were playing chess. She looked at him for a moment. You were planning ahead, she said. I was being, he said carefully, optimistic. She looked at the winter garden. At the bare rose bushes. At the space where, in summer, the chair would be, and the light would come through the trees the way light does in summer, generous and unhurried. Edmund, she said. Yes. I think we are going to be very happy here. He looked at the garden. At the house behind them. At the woman beside him who had come into his life through the peculiar, careful planning of a man who had loved her and known, better than she did, what she needed. Yes, he said. I think so too. The carriage came at 10. They went home. The following summer, on a warm afternoon in July, when the South Garden was everything it had promised to be in February, Vivienne Cavendish sat in a chair among the roses with a book she was not entirely reading. She was not entirely reading it because Edmund was at the desk inside. She could see him through the open window, working through the estate correspondence with the focused attention he brought to everything. And she was watching him in the way that she had learned over the past year that she liked to watch him. The way he reached for his pen. The way he pushed his hair back when he was concentrating. The way he sometimes looked up, for no apparent reason, and found her, wherever she was. He looked up. He found her. He said nothing. He simply looked at her, across the garden, through the summer air, in the way that Lady Harcastle had described, and that Vivienne now understood completely. She looked back. In the corner of the garden, half hidden behind a particularly enthusiastic rose bush, Delia's husband sketched in his notebook and said nothing at all, because he was a man who understood that the best portraits are made when the subjects have forgotten they are being seen. Vivienne had not forgotten. She simply no longer minded. She had spent 30 years learning to be seen on her own terms. She had finally, entirely, and without reservation succeeded. Thank you for staying with the story until the very end. Tell us which city you're watching from and how the story made you feel. If it stayed with you, leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next ones.